This is Maite Gonzalez presenting for Professor Luna's class of Minorities in America. I'm going to be presenting on Mexican Americans in America. This is the table of contents. It includes all of the needed headers, which is the migration experience, assimilation experiences, obstacles such as discrimination and prejudice, public policies created to exclude this people group, and along with public policies created to include this people group, labor roles and contributions, and achievements and impact this people group had on American culture. And beginning with migration experience. So Mexican migration to the US increased significantly in the early 20th century because of economic opportunities and political instability in Mexico, particularly because of the Mexican Revolution that began in 1910 and ended in 1917. Many migrants sought to work in agriculture, mining, and railroad construction. And up until about 1942, the migration was somewhat supported because the government facilitated the Bracero program, which facilitated Mexican labor migration, which allowed temporary workers to fill labor shortages during World War II. And okay, so I think I got these two slides mixed up. So first, before the Bracero program of 1942, the U.S. had reaffirmed the 1917 Immigration Act, which essentially said that the U.S. would not sign foreign contracts, like work foreign contracts, and which was obviously overturned with the facilitation of the 1942 Bracero program. Now moving on to assimilation experiences. Okay, so obviously everybody's experience is not going to be the same, and the reason for coming to America, they're different. Some came to America for education and employment, while others just came here for the American dream. Regardless of the reasoning, many maintained their strong cultural identities. And this led to the Chicano movement, which emphasized cultural pride and political activism, which challenged the ways of traditional assimilation. So I believe the Chicano movement was obviously like Chicano pride and Mexican American pride, and they're for the reason that there is a generation of Mexican Americans that don't know how to speak Spanish because either they refuse to speak Spanish to assimilate to be more American, or because their parents purposefully did not want them to speak Spanish for the same reason, to assimilate. Myself, I am Mexican American, and I had a softball coach. He was also Mexican, and I believe he's 60 or 70. He's in his 60s or 70s. But he is part of the generation that did not learn how to speak Spanish because of this assimilation process. Okay, and now moving on to number 3, obstacles, such as prejudice, discrimination, oppression, racism, and language. Mexican Americans encountered systemic discrimination, including segregation in schools, housing and employment, language barriers. Language barriers and racial prejudice limited their opportunities, and many faced exclusion from political participation. One event that stands out a lot in Mexican American history is the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, because it exemplified racial tensions where young Mexican Americans were targeted by law enforcement and white servicemen. The following quote is actually from the Library of Congress, and I'm just going to read a bit of it. So, discrimination and prejudice further compounded these challenges. Mexican immigrants were frequently subjected to racism, xenophobia, and social exclusion. Segregation in schools and housing, along with systemic inequalities in access to healthcare and social services, created an environment where upward mobility was difficult. And now, moving on to public policies created to exclude Mexican Americans. So, several policies were sought to limit Mexican American rights, including the Mexican Repatriation Program of the 1930s and the Operation Wetback of 1953. Operation Wetback, as it says here, hastened by increasing security concerns about potential communist infiltration of the United States. 1.2 million Mexican illegal aliens were arrested and deported to placate a mobilized anti-immigrant citizenry, particularly in Texas and California, where employers for a long time had simply ignored immigration laws and contracted the labor they needed whenever and however they wanted. Due to these programs and operations that forcibly deported thousands of Mexican Americans, by 1955, the number of Mexicans apprehended and deported by the INS dropped to 242,608. And now moving on to public policies created to include Mexican Americans. So, despite exclusionary policies, Mexican Americans fought for inclusion, and this includes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also known as the Literacy Act. And specifically, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that no person in the U.S. shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And then moving on to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is a piece of U.S. civil rights legislation that outlawed discriminatory voting practices, particularly those targeting African Americans in the South or generally people of color. It provided for federal oversight of elections in areas with a history of discrimination and prohibited discriminatory tactics like literacy tests. These two acts helped dismantle segregation and discrimination. And now, along with this, some organizations like LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, and MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Funds, advocated for equal rights. Now, moving on to labor rules and contributions. So, Mexican Americans played a big role in the U.S. labor force, especially, as mentioned before, in agriculture, construction, mining, and manufacturing. The United Farm Workers, or also known as UFW, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, fought for better wages and working conditions for farm laborers. And I'm just going to read a bit of this long quote, but here we go. By 1988, 1 out of every 9 Latinos in the U.S. was from Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. Nearly 250,000 Central Americans migrated to the U.S., destined for Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and New York City. Many Salvadorians and Guatemalans were undocumented because they were not recognized as political refugees, but as economic migrants. Central Americans had been activists in their home countries and in the U.S., became active in the United Farm Workers, UFW, and in el Centro de Acción Social Hermandad General de Trabajadores, also known as CASA.